It is September 15th, 2017. My name is Ashton Ellett. I'm here with Professor Trey Hood of the SPIA Survey Research Center, Professor of Political Science. And we're here today for the two-party Georgia Oral History program, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Thank you very much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Really appreciate you having here to sort of dig deep into the emergence of a two-party South, two-party Georgia, talk about Southern politics in great detail, as your research does. Go ahead and tell us a little bit about your upbringing and your introduction to politics and your scholarly approach to politics.
Okay. Well, I grew up in Texas. I grew up in Waco, Texas, and lived in Texas until 1999 when we came out here for a position. But politics was always part of my life because everybody in our family talked about politics. It was really inescapable, and we've lived somewhere in the South for several hundred years. So, along with religion, you talk about politics all the time.
Right.
So, in fact, I started out as a business major in college, and I was so bored I just switched to political science. I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I just knew that it was more interesting than business for me. So, and all my education was in Texas. Again, I came out here in 1999 as an assistant professor and took a position in the Department of Political Science, and I've been here ever since then. So,
now, were you always interested in focusing on Southern politics or party politics, or was that something that you arrived at later?
Well, I've always just been interested in studying what's right around me. And so it was just natural that I sort of fit into that mold, I think. I typically don't study anything outside of the American context, period, but most of what I do, or a lot of what I do is politics in the South. So, and I define the South as the former 11 states of the Confederacy. So people argue about that definition, but that's our definition.
You don't lump in Kentucky, Missouri, Oklahoma like some.
No, there certainly are some Southern characteristics with
Sure.
those states, but we just stick with the 11 states South. So.
I'm from Southern Illinois, and you could debate whether you put Southern Illinois into the South,
right,
culturally and politically. So, who are your major influences, your professional or scholarly influences that sort of directed your own research or direction into the field?
Well, I really didn't even know what I wanted to do in life, and I got a political science degree at Texas A&M, and I just sort of kept going to school, and eventually they make you start doing things like research and teaching, and that's fine. But again, I guess it was just sort of natural that I sort of segued into studying Southern politics because, again, that's what was around me and that's what interested me. Of course, I don't have a direct link to V.O. Key, but he certainly was a huge influence academically for me. He's sort of the grandfather, if you will, of Southern politics. And he was also from West Texas, and I lived in West Texas for quite a while. So we lived in Lubbock for 6 years. So, but I guess there's a professor when I was a graduate student, Erwin Morris, who's now the chair at the University of Maryland, and he certainly helped me. And again, later he was a co-author, one of my co-authors on a book we wrote. So. He certainly was an influence in political science in general and studying Southern politics. So.
Great. I definitely want to talk about your book in a little bit, but how would you describe Southern politics to either a general audience or somebody who is unfamiliar with the political culture, the political alignments in this region?
Well, at one level, it's just the study of politics on a regional scale. Now, there's an ongoing and long-running debate about whether the South is unique today or not unique. I mean, I would argue that the region certainly still is unique in a lot of ways, certainly politically and religiously speaking. and certainly you can easily make the historical argument that obviously the South, and again, we're defining it as the 11 states
Right,
that
the old
seceded, so
comparison,
certainly they had a common shared history that was unlike the other parts of the United States.
Right.
So, so that's how I would describe what we do to someone, from the outside, if you will. I mean, I guess you could study Northeastern regional politics, if you will, but again, Southern politics has been a long-defined sort of subgenre in political science and recognized as that. So certainly more so than other kinds of regional politics.
You mentioned V.O. Key, and we've talked about already the creation of a very rich subgenre of scholarly research and publication. Going back to 1949, which is the publication of Southern politics, and explain a little bit the influence of V.O. Key for non-political historians or political scientists.
Well, I mean, for one, he's still one of the most recognizable political scientists even today, even though he's been dead for decades, literally now. But he wrote Southern Politics in State and Nation, which sort of set up the study of Southern politics as sort of a decided subfield within political science. And his definition, again, of the South was this 11-state South. And so that's still very much with us today, those that study Southern politics. And also, he had a very strong emphasis, Key did, that is, on studying states within the South.
Right.
And so state-by-state analysis is still very utilized by political scientists, historians, sociologists.
Thankfully.
Right, right. So there's a very long-lasting, and usually anytime you're writing something on Southern politics, you at least have a sentence or two where you start with Key. What did Key say?
Yes.
And then you sort of move out from that point. So his legacy is really inescapable.
So when Key's writing, this is sort of the apex of the old one-party Democratic South, the solid South, if we were. And Key says that I believe he had 4 pillars that were hampering the political modernization of the South. And he said that eventually there would be this cross-racial, class-based sort of sorting of the electorate. And it would be because of economic development and sort of the rise of cities and things like that. Why did that not come to pass?
Well, again, I would say it's because of the racial issue and the way the race question played out. Now, there are people who would disagree with me even today and think that class and economics had a much stronger impact than race. But I'm from the school of thought that it was the racial issue and the race question that really drove two-party development in the South. And you're right. So he's writing right at the end of what I call the pre-civil rights era.
Right.
I mean, that's my own term for it. And so things are going to pretty rapidly change in the decade and a half after Key's writing.
Right.
So it's definitely a good starting point for someone interested in studying political science, or Southern politics, is to start at that point with Key. Because to understand Southern politics, you really have to understand history, is one of the things I tell my students. So.
And one that this historian would agree with. So we have V.O. Key, 1949. Who and what are some of the most significant sort of post-Key scholarly interventions that you as a political scientist have to know and have to sort of apply in their context to your own work?
There's a plethora of work that's been done since then. I mean, one of Key's own students, Bill Havard, wrote a book in about the early 1970s.
72, I think.
Yeah, it sort of picks up or tries to replicate what Key does, in a later time period. Bass and DeVries, the transformation of Southern politics. Again, a little bit later in the 1970s, again, they try to also replicate to a large extent what Key's done. More recently, our own Dr. Bullock here at the University of Georgia has been putting out a text that sort of does a state-by-state analysis, and there's been, I think we're up to the 5th edition or something like that. But it's one of the more recent works that looks at Southern politics in a comparative analysis. But there's all kinds of work that's been done, both by political scientists and historians, that are very important in terms of documenting what's been going on. And really the last 50 years has been a period of a very dramatic and rapid change at some points for the South, so politically speaking.
So where does your research come in? What is your, if you will, your contribution to the field or to that discussion of Southern politics, or how we understand that change?
Yeah, as you point out, when Key's writing, there's really just one party, one political party, and that's the Democratic Party, period. Everything pretty much goes on within the confines of the Democratic Party politically. So where we try to pick up is, how did two-party development come about? And so we're looking at the time period just after the Voting Rights Act in 1965, and our book goes up through 2008, so pretty currently. I don't think a lot's changed from 2008 to 2015, just similar patterns going on.
Right.
But that's where we try to sort of come into the scene, if you will, and offer at least our 2 cents on that political change that occurred in the South.
And what are those? What's the 2 cents? What's the upshot of your study?
Well, one is really that race and the racial issue is the major driver behind two-party development and what happened in Georgia as well as the rest of the South. Now, again, people will argue with me about that, or other scholars will argue with me, but we think there's pretty strong evidence for that hypothesis.
What sort of evidence do you use? Because as a historian, you go through manuscripts and secondary sources and newspapers. What evidence do you have to support that assertion?
Well, we look at some of those sort of historical documents like you're talking about, but the book is very much empirically based and data driven, and we collected decades worth of statistics on voter registration, racial data at various levels, the state, the county level, the individual level. So we use all kinds of data sources to try to get at this question and analyze them statistically. So,
okay, so you're talking about race as the primary driver of two-party, the two-party system, or the emergence of a modern two-party system. Does that mean that African Americans, we're talking primarily African Americans at this point, are sorting themselves into one party as the so-called, in quotes, bloc that Southern politicians always talked about? Or is this a push and pull?
I think it's push and pull.
Okay.
Now, you have to remember, prior to 1965, especially in the Deep South, there was just mass disenfranchisement of black Southerners, so they couldn't even participate politically. So, and that is one of the biggest changes over the last 50 years, obviously, is enfranchisement or re-enfranchisement, if you will, of African Americans in the South, period. And that, again, there's a lot going on simultaneously. So causally, it's a little difficult to tease out things.
Right.
But we do know all these things are happening, right? And so the few blacks who could participate, for instance, the middle class in Atlanta, the business owners, et cetera, again, I'm talking about African Americans.
Right.
They actually, maybe surprisingly to some people today, maybe not, actually were Republicans. Because, of course, at that point, the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln, the party that freed the slaves. But what we saw you're talking about a sorting mechanism very rapidly in the 1964 presidential election. And again, this is being accompanied by new enfranchisement of African Americans as well, that the black community just moves en masse almost completely to the Democratic Party. And before that, there was a legitimate question about which way black Southerners might go, to the Republican Party, to the Democratic Party. But they migrated fairly quickly to the Democratic Party, where they've remained since then. We're 50, 60 years later now, and nothing's changed in that regard.
Where northern African Americans had already begun moving, by and large, to the Democratic
Well, that
Party.
happened back with
Sure.
what we call the 1932 New Deal realignment.
Right.
So you're exactly right. But it just didn't matter in the South because there was no way for African Americans to participate politically.
Right. Outside of Atlanta and Savannah.
I mean, I'm not saying literally every African American was disenfranchised, but
Effective
by and large,
disenfranchisement, yes.
Yeah, right.
Okay, so you've talked about. Do you think that this sorting mechanism or the actual sorting would have played out the same way had it not coincided with the 64 Civil Rights Act, the 65 Voting Rights Act, sort of the Great Society era of the civil rights movement?
Well, that's a really interesting question.
One that I guess we never know.
I mean, it's a hypothetical, right? Because we know what did happen, and we can try to offer an explanation around those events. What if some of these things had not occurred? I don't really know the answer to that, to be honest with you. We could have come out with a different type of party system. That's certainly possible.
Okay, so how would you, sort of zooming into Georgia specifically, how would you describe Georgia politics, the sort of Georgia electorate in the context of the Deep South, of the larger South?
Right. So there was there were even higher levels of disenfranchisement of African Americans in the Deep South, especially. And Georgia's what we would call a Deep South state, along with Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina. Those are what we call the Deep South states. When Key was writing, it was very much a one-party state, again, the Democratic Party. And so everything's happening really within the Democratic primary. That's the only election that matters. The general election probably is not going to have a Republican or just sort of token Republican opposition. So the key for someone who wants to win office is to win their position in the Democratic primary, to win the Democratic primary. And that's tantamount to winning the election, essentially.
Old tantamount.
Right. So now what Key talks about are factions or groups within the Democratic Party within these states, and it varied state to state. Georgia, Key described as being weakly bifactional. Okay. So two different factions within the Democratic Party. The more coherent and organized faction was the Talmadge faction, named after Eugene Talmadge. And it included more than Eugene Talmadge, but he was sort of the major driver. And it wasn't uncommon in the South at that time to see factions, sort of being headed by demagogues. So he's a very colorful personality, to say the least.
Absolutely.
Now, the other faction was less organized and occasionally could win election, but it was just sort of termed by Key the anti-Talmadge faction.
Never a good thing when you're defined in opposition to the other faction.
Right. So they didn't have as much of a personality, if you will.
Right.
So that's sort of characterized the Georgia political or the party state before the Civil Rights era got started. So
this is also the period of the county unit system, which had been in various forms since turn of the century, and then 1917 up through 1962.
Right.
Was that unique to Georgia in its form and its function?
That was pretty unique. So the county unit system is sort of like an electoral college system at the state level. Instead of using states, you're using counties.
Right.
The only other state I know of that had anything like that, and it's really, I don't consider it a southern state, was Maryland.
Okay, I did not know that, no.
So 2 states out of 50, that's pretty unique,
Very,
right?
yeah.
It was definitely a Georgia thing, if you will. So, and it allowed for a couple of things. One, that rural areas could really control state politics.
Right.
And second, it acted to depress any black political influence, because again, most African Americans who could vote lived in cities. And again, what you're doing is you're depressing the vote of these cities for anyone living in the city, white or black. So it had those two effects. And it only applied to the Democratic primary,
Right.
but again, that's all that mattered.
Right.
So,
since you mentioned cities, what's been Atlanta's role in sort of the political development or the political modernization of Georgia?
well, certainly Atlanta is a huge economic driver, right? And before other parts of the state, it had a growing middle class, and that included both a white and black middle class. And so it certainly had that effect. And what would Georgia be without Atlanta? I don't know. We might look more like Alabama. Not that that's a bad thing, but you know, Atlanta is just such a huge dot on the map,
Right.
literally and figuratively. You know, you have major transportation hub, you know, corporate headquarters moving to Atlanta, you know, et cetera, et cetera. It's just really economically certainly reshaped the state's landscape.
I know it's hard to define moderating or moderate, but has that been a moderating effect on sort? If we talk about Georgia as being a conservative state, back when the Democrats were dominated by conservatives or with Republicans as a conservative party, has economic development been a moderating influence?
It has
on the
been.
party?
I mean, certainly the Atlanta was much more, as sort of a geographic area, typically was much more moderate on the race question
Right.
than the rest of the state. But again, as we just talked about, the rest of the state at that point could still dominate Atlanta. So you know, another thing that went on during this time period was the apportionment revolution that got rid of the got rid of the county unit system, and required that legislative districts be drawn with equal population count.
Right.
I mean, that's another one of these political changes that's not necessarily connected to everything else, but certainly had an impact that's going on right around the same time.
Exactly. 62 to 64.
Right.
And then 65, I think there was a special election.
Not Georgia. We'd gotten rid of our poll tax before that, but other
Right.
states are dropping their poll tax or being forced to drop their poll tax. So there's just a huge amount of change going on at this point in time.
So we've talked about malapportionment, the county unit system, and obviously what that did was sort of reify that urban-rural divide. Is that division politically, culturally still salient in places like Georgia, or is it less so? Is it still important to the politics?
I think so. You know, I again, people may disagree, but I sort of think of Georgia as being divided almost into three subregions today.
Sure,
the
sure.
Atlanta area, North Georgia above the fall line, and South Georgia below the fall line. It's gotten to be, at least in my opinion, where outside of Atlanta, North Georgia looks a lot more like South Georgia politically speaking.
Right.
So yes, to answer your question in general, I think it still matters.
I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I believe North Georgia's adherence to the Republican Party is actually stronger than South Georgia anymore in terms of raw percentages of the vote.
Right, I believe that's correct. Yeah.
What do you think? How do you explain that? Because when you think of South Georgia, you think of rural, conservative. Is it mainly the absence of African Americans in far North Georgia?
Well, I think it's. I don't think it's so much that today. I'm speaking more modern.
Sure.
I don't think it's that as much as most whites have simply just realigned to the Republican Party. And ideologically speaking, another point I like to make with students is that for whites, you know, their ideology didn't change. Most whites in the South are fairly conservative. What did change over time was their party affiliation, or which party they were gravitating towards. And so I think if you want to talk about something a little more modern, in 2002, the election of Sonny Perdue as governor, the first Republican elected post-Reconstruction in Georgia as governor, and we were actually the last southern state to elect a Republican as governor, which is sort of interesting as well. But one of the things that brought that about was a sort of, I guess you could say, finally decided realignment among whites, especially below the fall line,
Right.
to the Republican Party, and they seem to have remained there ever since then. So that's sort of Purdue's election is sort of a modern watershed moment, I think, for Georgia politics.
Alec Lamus, who's a political scientist from I think Case Western University up in Ohio, what he talked about back in the 1980s was a night and day coalition, a biracial coalition, a loose coalition, a troubled coalition of African Americans and rural conservative whites, about as polar opposite in terms of political ideology as you could get. Why was that coalition able to survive as long until 2002 or around there in the 1980s, 1990s, and then early 2000s? How was it able to prove so durable for so long?
Well, because it worked, for one. It produced electoral results, and I mean that's part of it. So, so that's another interesting point about all of this, is that around 1964, not exactly 1964 for everyone, but around that time period, you see white Southerners realigning, moving to the Republican Party.
Right.
But this process is very slow in coming about, and so this allows really into the 70s and the 80s and even into the early 90s, Democrats could continue to win elections with what are called biracial coalitions. So progressive and moderate whites and black Southerners combined to make the Democratic Party still a viable option. Now, over that time period, the Democratic Party in the South and in Georgia is becoming more liberal. Right. So it's very conservative, you know, just on the cusp of the civil rights era. And it shifts over, and now it's more moderate. And today I would say it's much more progressive or liberal. So, but that's another interesting thing that really produced a situation where these political changes really took decades to completely play out.
Right. And what do you think the role of Democratic incumbents was in holding together that coalition? People like Sam Nunn, Senator Sam Nunn, Zell Miller, people who I don't think you could necessarily tag them as liberals,
right?
In sort of the national party sense.
And they weren't really. I mean, they were moderates. They might even hold some conservative positions, like Zell Miller. But certainly, that's another good point, is that incumbents, one of the things we know from political science research is that incumbents usually win re-election. Now, one of the things that's also interesting, though, is that some of these incumbents were shifting some of their positions, especially on the race issue, as African Americans became an important component of their electoral constituency. But you're exactly right. That's another reason why it took literally decades for some of these changes to play out, was the role of incumbency, especially in Congress, in the U.S. Senate, and at those levels of office holding.
So it takes till 2002 for Sonny Perdue to get elected, a former Democrat, a party switcher. Why was Georgia so late to the game? What were Georgia Democrats just that much better at playing the game, or was it something else? Well, you know, we weren't Alabama or Mississippi or South Carolina. Why not?
Well, every state's different.
Right.
So, you know, we like to say the South is different, but even within the South, every state has its own nuances, and that's another thing that makes Southern politics interesting to study. I think part of that is that, yes, Democrats were fairly well organized up to a certain point, and were able to continue to say hold control in the legislature. So in 2000, the Democrats had unified control. They had the governorship, and the state house, and the state senate. In 2002, Sonny Perdue wins the governorship, so he's a Republican. And we had 4, I believe, state senators switch parties, which gave the state senate to the Republicans. And then in 2004, the state house switched to Republican majority control. So from 2000 to 2004, we had a complete flip, if you will. Now, some of this also was just a long time coming. Redistricting, demographic changes, party realignment. Republicans were steadily gaining seats into the late 80s and in the early 90s,
right,
in the state house and the state senate. So some of this was just, a very slow progression that, again, you just sort of get up to a certain point and you sort of breach the dam, and that's when the political change occurs.
And it probably would have happened sooner had it not been for the efficacy of democratic redistricting in the 1990s,
right,
and especially 2001.
Redistricting again is another one of these political influences that it's a complicated causal picture, if you will, because you're talking about all these factors, some of which are directly connected to one another and some of which aren't, but they all have an impact, right?
Right.
So I think also, going back to 1966, the Republicans had nominated Bo Callaway to run for governor, and he loses to Lester Maddox because he doesn't win a majority of the popular vote. It goes to a runoff. At that point, this is another sort of interesting story. It goes to the state legislature, actually, under the state constitution at that point. The state legislature is dominated by Democrats. They pick Lester Maddox. So I say all that. That's an interesting story in and of itself, if someone wants to read about that.
Oh, sure.
But I say that to say that Callaway really was riding some momentum even from the 1964 election for Republicans.
Right.
And it just his defeat as a gubernatorial candidate just sort of, for a while, just sort of stymied any more forward progress. So that's another reason that sort of the two-party system was slightly maybe retarded in terms of moving forward in Georgia.
What would it have meant? Because Bo Callaway, say he's elected governor, I think there's half a dozen Republicans in the legislature, well, slightly more. And then in '66, Fletcher Thompson and Ben Blackburn are elected to Congress. What would it have meant to have a Republican governor with basically overseeing a Democratic legislature? What would Callaway have been able to do for party development?
Well, I don't, he would have been at loggerheads with the legislature a lot, but I mean, success brings success.
Sure.
And so, the Republicans being able to capture the top statewide office, I think it would have brought in more money, more candidates. At that point, more people maybe switching parties. So you had incumbents even and experienced office holders switching parties. Again, it's another one of these hypotheticals we don't know the answer to, but certainly his loss had an effect, at least for a decade and a half or so with two-party development.
And then add to that, Watergate, Jimmy Carter's rise.
Yes.
You talked about factions within the Democratic Party. We've talked about what are the factions currently in our two parties here in Georgia or in the South? Well, let's talk about Georgia first.
Okay. Well, I mean, I don't. In some ways, I don't think Georgia's all that much different from a lot of other states. Within the Republican Party, sometimes people overlap on these, but of course you have sort of a social conservative bloc and an economic conservative bloc. Sometimes people are both. A lot of times people may be both, but if they're not, they usually fall into one of those other camps. And so, there can be friction, you sort of have the Chamber of Commerce wing, if you will, the business interested wing, just interested in producing economic growth.
Right.
And those that are social conservatives that, again, in Georgia especially, or the South, may be driven out of religious concerns a lot of times. So,
how important was the emergence of the so-called Christian right and its sort of I don't want to say immersion, but being brought into the Republican fold, because that wasn't, it was sort of an open question of which party it belonged in, and at least in Georgia in the 1980s.
Right, and so you had this racial realignment, and I sort of view that as in a way it's not over the race question. It's very much religiously driven, but it's almost like a second realignment, because again you have a group of individuals that are ideologically very conservative,
Right.
certainly socially very conservative, who may have been, probably were Democrats, most of them voted Democratic. So now they have a new possibility, if you will. So yes, I mean, in the late 70s, the very late 70s into the 80s, that was another sort of crucial block that was moved into the Republican Party in Georgia, in the South, and even in other parts of the country. Like you could look at some place like Iowa, for instance.
Oh yeah, absolutely. What about the Democratic Party? Is this solely a party divided by race, or is it more complicated than that?
Well, it's more complicated than that, but certainly in the South and in the Deep South, where you have large concentrations of African Americans, they are the key component, I would say, today of the Democratic Party, these state Democratic parties. And certainly they can control primary outcomes, for instance, in Democratic primaries. And so you have with these black Southerners, you really have some other groups in there, white progressives and some white moderates. Although they're, one of the things we seem to have lost over time are moderates, both at the office holding level and at the mass level. So, the white conservatives have migrated to the Republican Party, the white progressives to the Democratic Party. There aren't that many moderates, really.
In either party?
Not today, per se. And I think earlier, of course, you saw the migration of white conservatives to the Republican Party, but even extended to white moderates, in the 80s, the 90s. So I'm not saying there are no moderates today, but there's definitely sort of a polarized landscape today. So I don't know if that answered you.
Yeah.
I mean, and it still is really a white and black world to a large extent. A lot of people are talking about growth of other racial and ethnic groups, and that's all true. It's going to take literally decades, though, for those effects to be felt, I think. So
the argument that demographics are destiny when it comes to politics, it seems like what you're saying is, yes, there is growth, and it may be rapid growth in other demographic subsets, Hispanics, Latinos, Asian Americans, especially in DeKalb and Gwinnett counties, but their numbers are still relatively small in comparison to whites and black Southerners.
Right, they are in Georgia at least. Of course, it's a different situation, say in Florida or Texas, but we're talking about Georgia. And on the demographics as destiny hypothesis, one, you'd have to see these demographic trends continue into the future, and we think they're going to, but we don't know that for certain. But the other thing is that on the demographics as destiny hypothesis is that nothing's going to upset that balance. In other words, it's going to be, race is still going to be the major driver underneath the political party system. What if something changes? So then, so you have to sort of hold that constant that this is going to be what's going to happen 20 years from now. And who knows, there could be some new issue that comes about that creates a new cleavage point in the party system.
Or
and I don't know.
A new candidate or something.
Right, yeah.
So the trend has been that white Southerners, or white Georgians, especially white males, have been sorting themselves into the Republican Party in larger and larger numbers. I think Hillary Clinton, the CNN exit poll, I think, was 21% of the white vote. Do you think that is a trend that is likely to continue?
Well, I think it's going to reach a ceiling, if you will. I think I calculated it at less than 20%.
Oh, wow.
Some estimates.
Wow.
So, and of course, you have at least typically 95% of African Americans voting Democratic, right? So very polarized on terms of voting patterns. But I think you're going to reach some ceiling, right? I mean, and again, that's just based literally on demographic racial groups in the state.
So yeah, that Hillary Clinton was able to win Cobb and Gwinnett counties. I think most people, if they're looking, they wake up in the middle of the election night, and the only data they see is that Hillary Clinton has won Cobb and Gwinnett. The assumption would be that she's going to carry Georgia. Why was that not the case?
Well, now there has been demographic change going on in those metro Atlanta counties, and that's part of it. But it's interesting. I mean, so obviously, if someone's looking at this oral history 20 years from now, we had a very interesting presidential election with Donald Trump, and so I think this is my own hypothesis.
Sure.
Not substantiated with empirical data yet, but my own thinking is that there were a lot of conservative Republicans in Georgia, and Georgia really wasn't in play for the presidential election, so we have to take that into account. But there are a lot of conservative Republicans in Georgia who were more than willing to vote Republican down ticket for anyone, but didn't really want to vote for Donald Trump. And they could sort of do that safely, right? They weren't going to vote for Hillary Clinton, I'm not saying that, but they just didn't cast a ballot, or they wrote in someone like Paul Ryan, or, that wasn't going to count.
Or there was the Libertarian.
There was a Libertarian.
I'm not sure what the vote was. It was slightly higher, I think, than
just slightly,
but not much.
Because, if you look at like the congressional vote in Cobb County,
right.
It's much higher than what Trump got, and so I think there was some of that going on. I mean, that's my hypothesis, at least.
Okay. Since we just talked about the 2016 election, there was a very historic special election in the 6th congressional district that you just mentioned. Republican voting in Cobb. Donald Trump appointed Tom Price, who is the incumbent congressman, Republican from the 6th district, and there's a special election for that. Explain the process. Why were the Democrats able to run so well in a reliably Republican district?
Well, one, I mean, it's an open seat at that point.
Sure.
It's a special election, so you're going to have typically lower turnout. There's nothing else going on, so you have to make a point to turn out to vote in that special election. And the Democrats certainly did much better than, someone that would have been challenging Price, who was the incumbent.
Right.
He was winning very handily. I think he won by 20 points or something.
It was like 16, 17, 18.
Close
enough.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, there's another case, though, where Price wins by a huge margin, and Donald Trump, I think, wins by a couple of points. So there's this gap I'm talking about. But at some point, I mean, it's a Republican-leaning district. It was drawn that way, and that's what happens in the end, despite huge efforts on the part of the Democratic Party, even the DNC, the National Democratic Party, to get Democrats in that district to the polls. There just weren't enough Democrats in that district in the end, mathematically, to push the Democratic nominee Ossoff, over the 50% mark. And there was a runoff, and I think he got 48% in the special election and 48% in the runoff. So he didn't improve his vote margin at all in the end. So I can't remember exactly what question you asked me.
I think we were just talking about the special election and why it played out the way it did, and essentially you just can't squeeze blood from a stone.
Exactly. I mean, if there are only so many Democrats in that district, there are only so many Democrats, and if they don't comprise a majority, you're going to have a hard time winning. Typically, right?
Right.
Strange things can happen in politics.
Sure. But I think what the warning there is that even if there is demographic change, it can be overcome by strategic drawing of legislative districts.
And it certainly wasn't due to any shortfall in money being
spent.
No,
absolutely
not.
That was the
most, now that is the most expensive congressional race ever. Now that may be eclipsed, in the future.
No doubt it will.
That gives you some indication that both sides were throwing all kinds of money at that election, and that was sort of the only show in town nationally. So everybody could just sort of concentrate on that. And in the end, we end up with, what someone would think should happen if you were just looking at some data from the district, for instance.
We talked about factions. I just remember we were talking about factions a while ago. If we had sat down, if this were 2010 or 2011, there's no way I couldn't not ask about the Tea Party. Whatever, we don't hear the Tea Party anymore. Have they been? Whatever happened to the Tea Party in the Republican Party?
Well, in some ways, the sort of the standard Republican and the Tea Party Republican, ideologically, they're both conservative.
Right.
They don't really have that much of a disagreement over most issues. I always viewed the Tea Party as a faction that sort of came into office in 2012, 2014, around that time, to a large extent 2010. Mm-hmm. A group of Republicans that were elected that wanted to see some change happen. So it's not that their issue positions were different from other Republicans, but they wanted to see some action on something. Instead of just talking about things, they wanted to actually change some things. Now, again, a lot of that was stymied just by the structure of our political system. Change is hard to come about, period. Mm-hmm. But this group's not, there's still, I guess, Tea Party Republicans in the congressional delegation.
Yes, the Freedom Caucus
is
what it is.
So they haven't gone away, but certainly, you're right, no one's using these terms anymore, really, to a large extent.
Why have Democrats, not just in Georgia, why has the Democratic Party in the South been unable to make much of a comeback? We're talking 15 years of Republican dominance, supermajorities in both houses of the state legislature, every constitutional office, statewide, presidential elections, Senate. Why have the Democrats not been able to mount a creditable comeback?
Well, again, it is to a large extent right now, I'd say, just based on sort of the demographic composition of the state. And again, if you have a lot of whites who are conservative, who are in the Republican Party, mathematically, a lot of times, certainly at the state level, or an aggregation of the state level, say in the legislature, it's just pretty easy to dominate.
Right.
Now, again, that could change in the future, but that's the pattern we've seen, really, you're right, for about 15 years in Georgia.
Do you think and obviously, again, another hypothetical, is it going to be an issue, perhaps, or a candidate that is, do Democrats have to pull off white votes, or is it an issue of turning out more minorities, more young people?
I think you may not have reached a mathematical turnout ceiling, but I don't think that's the solution for the Democratic Party.
Which solution? The maximizing minority vote?
Well, you have a maximized minority vote. I don't know that you can turn out that many more minorities. Sure. Turnout's obviously a key to winning elections,
right,
but
right.
I think, to answer your question, I think the Democratic Party has to win back some of those white voters in the short run, at least. Now, again, we can talk about the demographics as destiny hypothesis, and if nothing changes in 20 mm-hmm. years from now, well, maybe not. But I think right now, contemporarily, the Democratic Party has to continue to turn out minorities, which they've been able to do, especially in 2008, 2012 in Georgia, and even in the midterms. But they've got to sort of win back, they being the Democratic Party, some white voters somehow.
Right. Voter ID. Voter suppression. You've done some work on sort of the rationale behind those laws and then sort of the actual empirical consequences of them. What has your research found in terms of voter ID?
Well, you have these beliefs out there, and they're not necessarily based on fact, but people have very strong beliefs. So a lot of conservatives believe that voter fraud is rampant and that this is one solution to try to curb voter fraud. There's not a lot of evidence empirically that voter fraud's rampant. On the other side, you have minorities, white progressives who believe that things like voter ID laws are suppressing turnout. I mean, these are genuinely held beliefs by
absolutely.
both these sides.
Right.
There's not a lot of empirical evidence for that either. I mean, Georgia's had a voter ID law, photographic government-issued photo ID law since 2007, so it was in place in 2008. I mean, you still hear some people talk about it, but most voters have adjusted. You know, we've had quite a few federal election cycles with the voter ID law in place. It's not really that big of an issue in the state. We did a study. We found that it may have had a slight suppressive effect on turnout overall, but that white voters were actually more affected than minority voters, especially black voters.
Why was that? Because that sort of runs contrary to conventional
right.
wisdom.
Well, I can't explain fully. I mean, that's the empirical result we got. And of course, with these laws, there's usually a safe haven, if you will. You know, the state has provided a free ID program. So there are ways for people who may not have a driver's license or a government-issued photo ID to comply with the law at no cost. So some people have made that adjustment as well. So, but it's been in place, again, since 2007 in Georgia. So it's not been that big of a deal lately. And I haven't heard a lot of talk about it.
You were talking earlier. We talked about the Republican majority and demographics. What is if we're looking ahead, what is the greatest threat to the current Republican majority status in Georgia? Is there one?
I think in the very, very short term, no, not really. Now, again, we're going to have a redistricting cycle coming up in a few years, and that can always have an effect. Of course, both sides will use redistricting to try to gain an advantage to the extent to which they can. I don't really see a threat to sort of the Republican dominance in the state near term.
Right.
So,
long term?
Well, again, some of these demographic changes can certainly have an effect.
Do you think there are any policy disagreements that are significant enough to sort of divide Republicans in a way that Democrats could gain an advantage?
I don't know about at the state level. I don't know that would happen.
At the national?
I mean, I think I think it's possible, with a really bad Republican candidate for governor and a really great Democratic candidate and some issues going on, that I'm not saying a Democrat couldn't win statewide office, but even if they did, is it just sort of a fluke and then you go back to the same pattern you had?
Right.
So
do you think it would be easier for a Democrat to win statewide than for the Democrats to retake the legislature?
Probably, yes. I mean, given certain circumstances, yeah.
Okay. Well, the next thing I guess I wanted to talk about is 2018. Looking ahead, at the Republican side, you have the sitting Lieutenant Governor Casey Cagle, who's been Lieutenant Governor since 2006. A couple state senators, Mike Williams, Hunter Hill. And then our fellow Athenian, Brian Kemp, Secretary of State. How do you see that? And I think there's news of another candidate whose name escapes me at the moment, former Navy SEAL.
I can't even remember.
Clay Tippins.
Yeah, okay, good.
It came to me.
And there could be others. I mean, we're way out, right?
Right.
Out.
Qualifying ends in April.
Right.
So we're way out. But how do you see the Republican primary sorting itself out in Georgia?
Well, I mean, if again, I'm making a guess about the future. I think it could easily come down to a runoff between sort of Kemp and Cagle, two figures who have held statewide office and who are known to a lot of Georgians, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's entirely possible. It could come down to something like that. Again, something crazy could happen, though. There could be some issue we don't even know about at this point come up. I mean, that's
Right.
what makes politics interesting.
Right. Or, Republican outsiders in general, I should say, in both parties have a relatively poor record. Senator David Perdue, I think, would be the exception to that. But on the Democratic side, you have two known quantities in Stacey Evans and Stacey Abrams, the former minority leader. I guess they're both retired from the House.
Right.
Now, that's an interesting race. I guess the easy question is white and black, but is it, again, more complicated than that, or do you think that the demographics will sort of determine that race?
Well, that's going to be really interesting because it may just come down to white and black. It may not be much more complicated than that. I guess we have to sort of see how things play out in terms of the issues these candidates are talking about and want to highlight. But certainly, I would think that, white progressives within the Democratic Party in Georgia are gonna support one candidate. I mean, that would be my guess at this point.
Right.
And certainly black Georgians are going to support the other candidate. So it's going to be interesting to see if that is how things play out. It could, there could be some nuances as well. I mean, it's not necessarily one way or the other a dichotomy, but I think to a large extent it may fall along racial lines.
How much do you think the sort of specter of Donald Trump or the Trump administration is going to play on this upcoming election or the electorate?
Well, I think Democrats can try to mobilize against Trump. I don't really think it's going to have a major play or effect on the Republican side of things,
right.
really.
What do you think do you think there's going to be a long-term shift in the electorate, given, Donald Trump is not a I guess, orthodox Republican in the way a George W. Bush or a Mitt Romney or a Marco Rubio would have been. How, as a political scientist, can you actually suss out the effect of a president on maybe the state party or the electorate?
Well, but one answer to that is we don't know.
There's a lot
yet.
of questions rolled into that.
Well, we don't know yet, for one thing. He hasn't even served a year in his term. I would say in the South, including Georgia, it's probably not going to have that big of an effect. The voters that Trump was able to draw across the line were in a lot of these sort of Rust Belt states, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan, and they were white voters who were Democrats, who many of them voted for Barack Obama, and then they voted for Trump. Now, whether that pattern is going to persist, I don't know, and that's the question. In Georgia, most whites, certainly most white Republicans, voted for Trump. If they voted for him, again, that's one of my hypotheses. They certainly didn't vote for Hillary Clinton, though, and they're certainly not going to revert back,
Sure.
to voting for Democratic candidates. So I think Trump's effect really is probably going, if there is an effect long term, it's going to be outside of the South more so than in the South.
What was the effect? Because there's anecdotal evidence, and there might be by now actual empirical evidence that Donald Trump was able to boost turnout in traditionally Republican counties, but like the rural South, rural counties, that he could bring more whites to the polls. Because the critique of the Republican Party is that they were always doubling down on whites, and that was a problem, but Trump was actually able to find more white voters.
He probably did, turn out more voters than, say, another sort of run-of-the-mill Republican candidate may have been able to do. Now, again, and that's probably true even in Georgia. But again, what's going to happen without Trump? Are these people, I would suspect most of these people, if they've not been voting, will just revert back to a pattern of not voting, not participating politically, not changing alliances necessarily.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yes. So back to you. We're just sort of wrapping up a bit. What are your current projects? You're director of the SPIA, which is the School for Public and International Affairs.
Right.
The head of the Survey Research Center. What do you do in that capacity?
Right. Well, it's very much student driven, and it's a fully staffed, essentially, call center. So we're doing live phone
Oh,
interviews
wow.
with, and again, our goal, maybe this fits with our interview, is to become specialists for the state of Georgia
Yeah.
on politics and policy and public opinion. We're opening up this coming Monday. We had planned to open up the previous Monday. Since we're in an oral history interview, I want to commit to history that Hurricane Irma delayed the opening of the SPIA Survey Research Institute. So.
That's right. We were UGA was closed for 2 days, 2.5 days.
And then the rest of the state, which we
Sure.
would be surveying, a lot of the rest of the state was affected by power outages and
Right.
things. So
So you're doing phone interviews. Is this a polling? How does this relate to, say, the Gallup poll or PPP or Survey USA?
we're
polls?
doing exactly the same thing. Again, we're doing it with students, though. It's very much student driven,
Right.
and it's very much designed to be a learning
Okay.
a learning exercise for students. But it's completely real in that we're doing exactly the same things that, say, a national survey firm will be doing, following the same kinds of practices and scientific principles they would. Again, we just really want to survey Georgia, though, and become
Right. Well, it's actually incredibly interesting. I'm a polling nerd who reads 538 and Victory Lab and Nate Cohn on New York Times. Talk to me about the state of polling in politics. Obviously, I also follow British politics is completely different, and they have their own problems.
right.
But the perception versus the reality in terms of polling these
Well,
days.
the polling industry is in rapid change. A lot of it's being produced by technological change, and the fact that people are using cell phones versus landlines. I mean, this is sort of down in the weeds.
Oh,
but
sure. Let's get
very much
down
very
in the
much
weeds.
in flux, very much in change. But one of the things I like to point out to people is that there are two main kinds of polls. There are election tracking polls, and there you're really trying to make a prediction about the future. Mm-hmm. And that's not easy to do.
Right.
And there are other polls that we conduct where we want to just survey Georgians about, current political or policy positions. We want to explain what they're thinking. I think we can do a pretty good job with those polls. They're very informative. We can come up with explanations for why people think the way they're thinking. We can get a gauge on public opinion. Should we have a tax increase or a decrease in Georgia? So we spend much more of our time doing those kind of polls than election tracking polls. But of course, everyone loves election tracking polls.
The horse
So
race.
when the election tracking polls are wrong, that's what everybody points to. So I always like to just be a little humble and say we have to take these with a grain of salt. This is our best gauge on what's going on currently. But with an election tracking poll, you're also trying to predict turnout, and that's not easy to do as well. So there's very much a distinction within the polling world concerning what kind of poll you're doing and what you're trying to do. And again, I think we do a really good job typically if practices are followed in explaining where people stand politically or talking about policy issues. But again, it's the tracking polls that get all the press notoriety, and it's like trying to predict the outcome of a football game.
Sure.
Why do we do that? I don't know. I guess everybody's still interested in that, right? At some point, it just doesn't matter. But yes, sometimes tracking polls are off. So they were off in the last presidential election in some states. So.
Right. Since we're in the weeds already, do you weight your polls differently for issues versus campaign tracking?
Yes. I mean, if you're doing a tracking poll, you've got to in your weighting scheme, you've got to try to predict what the outcome of what the electorate's going to look like in terms of turnout. And again, going back to Georgia politics, it still very much is a black and white world. And just knowing the racial composition of the electorate can get you way down the road, maybe not all the way down the road, but quite a bit of the ways down the road in terms of predicting what the outcome's going to be in that election. So,
Okay, you have the policy or the survey research that what sort of upshots from your research have you gotten from your polling? So have you put any polls in the field yet?
Well, we're getting started Monday.
Okay.
This coming Monday.
That's right. That's right.
So the answer to that's not yet, but hopefully we're going to start to collect data on Georgia, and we can formulate a profile, a political profile of the state, and we can keep updating that over time. That's my hope.
Okay.
That we can collect data over time on the same questions and measurements.
Now, is this going to be an open source that news sources or graduate students writing papers, or is this going to be for the goal for SPIA to turn out publications based on the data?
Well, certainly. I mean, if we're doing a poll, if SPIA is doing a poll, there'll be an embargo period, but after that, the data will be publicly available for anyone, media, researchers, graduate students, whoever wants to use it.
Great.
I will say, academically, sort of back on the Southern politics side, that one of my co-authors, Seth McKee, and I have just started a book project. Now, we're not very far down the road.
Took my next question out of my mouth.
And it's on Hispanics in the South. So
yes.
Again, since Key, since even before Key, really, if you go back to the colonial era, if you will, it's been sort of the black-white dichotomy is what we call it. So now we have sort of a third ethnic group in the mix, very much in play in some states like Texas and Florida. So we want to look at, especially more recently over the last several decades, how have Hispanics reshaped Southern politics or are reshaping Southern politics?
Do you have a working hypothesis so far?
Well,
a research question.
Right now,
we have your research question.
Exploratory. Well, the research question is, what effect
right.
is this new racial or ethnic group having, or this new ethnic group having on Southern politics? Is it changing things or not? And we're sort of in the data collection stage at this point, so we're at very early stages. But that's our goal.
Right. I mean, it's very interesting knowing your last publication, which is The Rational Southerner. I guess the expectation or the conventional wisdom, especially in the age of Donald Trump, is that there's going to be another sort of sorting of another minority group, might be a majority group in Texas by the time somebody sees this or reads the transcript.
Right.
Is there going to be another sorting, and what's the mechanism of that from into the Democratic Party?
Or maybe not.
Or not.
I think Hispanics are much more, again, this is very much a generalization. Hispanics as a group are much more complicated than this. But they're certainly not 95% in the Democratic camp. They typically tend to be majority Democratic. Mm-hmm. But I think they're much more pliable, if you will. And I think you're going to see a fight by both parties for Hispanic votes. What might happen? I think the immigration issue writ large, and I don't know what's going to happen on it. But,
very salient
again,
here
this
in
is
2017.
Part of Donald Trump's mantra,
right.
And one of his major sort of campaign promises and points he campaigned on.
Right.
Maybe nothing's going to happen, but I very much think that the immigration issue might have an effect on which way Hispanics migrate long term.
Right. We were talking about, does Trumpism last past Trump?
I don't know. Yeah.
Right. And I think it'll be very interesting to see what your research bears out, whether Hispanics are going to go back to the sort of 60-40 voting during the George W. Bush years, or if it's going to, shift decidedly in the Democratic direction. Well, Dr. Hood, it's been excellent having you here.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
The two-party Georgia oral history program, the Russell Library. I deeply appreciate it. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts and your expertise with us.
Thank you.